In January of 2019, my Uncle Reggie Howell died of pancreatic cancer. And my uncle was a pretty incredible guy. He was a cheater when it came to board games and card games. He loved his family, loved his church. My mom always described him as being like Forrest Gump. I hope that when I die, nobody describes me as being like Forrest Gump. It's not a very flattering comparison, but I think what my mom meant is that my uncle had this tendency to be caught up in stories bigger than himself. And my uncle was great at golf. And I don't just mean that my uncle was good at golf like you are good at golf, or good at golf like your buddy is good at golf. My uncle was great at golf. In fact, earlier in his life, my uncle had the opportunity to pursue a professional career in golf, but he chose not to because he knew it would take him away from his family. But because he was so good at golf, my Uncle Reggie had some opportunities afforded to him that you and I will probably never have. For instance, my uncle was able to play golf with some of the biggest names in golf, including Tiger Woods. He had many sports connections because of how good he was at golf. And because of this, he was in the first fantasy football league in the state of Texas. And he's now honored in the National Football Hall of Fame. And because he was so good at golf and he had all these sports connections, in January of 1996, my uncle found himself getting caught up in a pretty big story. A local DJ in Texas asked my uncle if he would like to come to the Super Bowl that year where the Dallas Cowboys were playing and do a pregame show with him. Now, my uncle was a huge sports fan, so of course, my uncle said yes. So my uncle goes to the Super Bowl, and he does the pregame show with this DJ, but the thing is they actually didn't have tickets to the Super Bowl. They were just doing a pregame show outside of the stadium, and then their plan was to go back to the hotel and watch the game on the TV there. Well, as they were finishing up their pregame show, an executive for the Dallas Cowboys walked by their booth. And this executive happened to know the DJ that my uncle was there with. And they start talking, and the executive gets to the point where he asks them, well, where are you all sitting? And they say, well, we don't really have seats. We're planning on going back to the hotel to watch the game. And the executive says, no way. You are coming up to the box with me. So my uncle goes up to this box to watch Super Bowl 30 with the executives for the Dallas Cowboys. And if you know your football history, you know that the Cowboys won Super Bowl 30 that year. And the energy in the room, you've got to imagine, was just through the roof as the Cowboys won. Well, as everyone's celebrating in this box, some of the executives start to head towards the field to celebrate with the Cowboys. And my uncle, being the goofy, mischievous guy that he was, decides that he's going to see if he can just blend in with the crowd and go down to the field with them. And so here goes my uncle, this mischievous, goofy, 6'5" tall orange man, probably in a bright polo, but he makes his way down to the football field and he gets to celebrate the win of the Super Bowl with the Dallas Cowboys and the executives down there on the field. Well, I don't know what's wrong with my uncle, but while he was down there, he noticed that some of the players were heading off towards the locker room, and he started to wonder how far he could take this thing. So my uncle once again kind of just wanders down into the locker room with the Dallas Cowboys. And he sits there waiting to see if anyone's going to say anything to him, like, you shouldn't be here. But nobody does. In fact, my uncle gets to sit in the locker room with the Cowboys as the coach talks to the Cowboys about winning the Super Bowl. And my family swears that there's proof of this. They couldn't find it. And I'm really upset because I would love to show you this picture. But they say that there's a picture of the Cowboys holding the Super Bowl trophy in the locker room. And my uncle is standing behind some of them, reaching over them and putting a finger on the trophy so that he could say he touched the Super Bowl trophy. Well, that would be a good story, but it doesn't end there. See, my uncle then noticed that people were wandering off to the buses to go back to their hotel. Well, my uncle was not staying at the same hotel as the Dallas Cowboys, but because he was him, he decided that he was going to try to get on the bus and see if he could just ride with them. So my uncle, pretending like he knows what he's doing, goes and gets on a bus with the team. He ends up sitting next to a guy named Charles Lewis Haley, who's now a Hall of Famer. And Charles and my uncle become buddy-buddy on the ride back to the hotel. My uncle's telling him how big a fan he is, and they just talk. My uncle was really good with people. And they get back to the hotel, and Charles and my Uncle Reggie actually walk into the hotel together. And they're standing there in the lobby, and Charles asks my uncle what his plans are for the rest of the night. And my uncle tells him, well, you know, I actually am not even staying at this hotel. I'm just going to get a taxi and head back to where I'm staying. Well, this made Charles laugh. So Charles asked my uncle, do you just want to come to this Super Bowl party with us? Well, my uncle says, yeah, I'd love to, but I don't have a sports coat. So I'm not dressed for it. I couldn't possibly do that. Well, Charles says, I think I know a guy who's about your size. And so my uncle and Charles Lewis Haley get on this elevator. They go up to a room. Charles knocks on the door. And Barry Switzer, head coach of the Dallas Cowboys, opens it. Charles looks at Barry and he says, hey, this guy's come to the party, but he needs a coat. Do you have an extra one? And Barry says, yeah, give me a second. He comes out, gives my uncle an extra coat that he brought. And my uncle goes to the Super Bowl party with the Dallas Cowboys after they won the Super Bowl. He's with the like of Charles Lewis Haley, Barry Switzer, Emmitt Smith, Troy Aikman, and he's there wearing an extra coat from Barry Switzer. Can you imagine? And this was kind of normal for my uncle. He just had this habit of getting caught up in stories that were bigger than him. But if you knew my uncle, you'd know that more than anything, he was caught up in God's story. Towards the end, my uncle was going through chemo. And if you've been to chemo before, you've accompanied somebody else to chemo, you kind of know what it's like. There's a lot of recliners. People are sitting in them as they're getting their treatment. It's pretty quiet. It can be somber or kind of a dour atmosphere. People watching things on their computers or reading. Well, for my uncle, chemo time was social time. He almost looked forward to it. He always brought somebody with him. On this particular occasion, he had a grand old time with his buddy, and he and his friend are leaving chemo when my uncle looks over and he sees a young woman who's sitting by herself. And she looks pretty scared. So my uncle turns to his friend and he says, give me a minute. My uncle goes over to this woman and he sits with her. He asks her how she's doing. He asks her if he can pray for her, and she lets him. And he sits with her through her chemo treatment after he had just received his. Later, my uncle would say that that was really uncomfortable for him. That was way outside of his comfort zone. But he did it because my uncle is caught up in God's story. If somebody were up here today talking about you, what story would they say you are caught up in? If you're like me, that can be a pretty daunting question. It's hard to digest. So let me help you out a little bit. There's a guy by the name of Robert McKee who wrote a book called Story, also one of the most influential speakers and authors in the world of Hollywood screenwriting. And Robert McKee says that there are essentially three components to a story or to a character's arc. Somebody who wants something, and then they overcome obstacles, and then they get it. But Robert McKee says that first part, what a character desires most, what their goals are, determines the course of the story. He says that if you want to know what the story of a character is, just look at what their wants, desires, and goals are. In the same way that when you're driving, where you look determines where you go. This is why when you're driving, at least I was told this growing up, you don't want to look at someone riding a bike next to you because you might kind of start to drift towards them a little bit. Well, in the same way, what a character wants determines where they go. What a character wants determines the story they're caught up in. And so if you have trouble answering that question, what story would people say I was caught up in if they were talking about me today? One of the best things you can do is just ask yourself the question, what are my top wants, desires, and goals in life? And so I actually want to give you a second to do that here today. I'm going to give you a couple of minutes. You can pause the video if you want to here in just a second. And all I want you to do is write down or talk to the person next to you and tell them or write down what are your top 2 or 3 goals and wants in life right now. And just spend some time thinking about that. And when you're ready, unpause the video. Well, since you all were potentially vulnerable with each other, I'll be vulnerable with you today. Here are the top 3 wants and goals that I wrote down for myself when I did this exercise earlier this week. I want to find a group of people who are around my age to be in community with, in the same life stage as me. I'd like to become more financially stable, which probably should mean that I become better with my money. But kind of in my mind when I say that, I mean that I just want to be making a lot more money. And third, I would love to find a romantic relationship to be in. Some of you probably have some similar life goals to me, desires. Some of you probably wrote down marriage or having a baby, retiring. Hopefully nobody wrote down that they hope something happens to their spouse. But I want you to hold your top 2 or 3 goals in your mind. And I want to look at just a couple of places where Jesus talked about some of his wants and goals. And these are not all of Jesus' wants and goals when he was here on the earth. These are just two scriptures I pulled out as an example. But let's look at them here today. This is Luke 4:18. This is what Jesus says about his goals. The Spirit of the Lord is on me because he has anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim freedom to the prisoners and recovery of sight for the blind, to set the oppressed free. Here's another one in Matthew 20:28, where Jesus talks about his goals. The Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many. So again, these are not the only verses where Jesus talks about his goals. I'm just making a point here. Here's my summary of his top goals or wants in these verses. Number 1, Jesus wants to bring about healing for the broken and the oppressed in the here and now. Top one or goal for Jesus. Number two, he wants to share the good news with people and bring them into the kingdom of heaven. And number three, of course, Jesus wanted to save us from our sins, and he was willing to sacrifice himself to do that. I want you to hold your goals that you wrote down or shared with the person next to you in your mind, and hold with them Jesus' wants or goals, either the ones I just listed or some others that you come up with. I want you to ask yourself the question, how much overlap is there? In other words, how many of your wants, goals, and desires are kingdom wants, goals, and desires? See, what I'm going to propose to you today is that many of us have attempted to make God a part of our stories rather than being caught up in God's story. And you may be asking, well, so what? So what if my top goals, my top wants are not kingdom goals or kingdom wants? If the story that I'm caught up in is my story, but God's a part of it, so what? I go to church. I'm a part of a small group. I give money. Sometimes I feed the homeless. I've been on mission trips. What's the big deal if I've made God a part of my story rather than being swept up in his story? My answer to that is that I believe the verse we are going to look at today and study communicates that God is not interested in being a part of your story. God is interested only in catching you up in his story. So we're going to look at Mark chapter 8 today, and a little context before we do. Jesus has just asked Peter, who do you say I am? And you know the story. Peter says, you're the Christ, you're the Messiah. Except for Peter has a very different definition for what it means to be the Messiah than Jesus does. To Peter, being the Messiah meant that Jesus was going to be somebody who got the leaders, the elders together, unified Israel, and in force brought Israel out of Roman captivity, out of Roman rule. That's what Peter means when he says that Jesus is the Messiah. Jesus gives Peter the thumbs up, but then Jesus goes on to define what it means to actually be the Messiah. And I just want you for a second to put yourself in Peter's shoes and just imagine what it's like to hear Jesus say some of these things, if that's what you're expecting. This is verse 31 of Mark 8. He then began to teach them that the Son of Man must suffer many things, be rejected by the elders, the chief priests, and the teachers of the law. He must be killed, and after 3 days rise again. Well, I'll tell you right now, if I'm Peter, I didn't even get to the third thing where Jesus says that he rises again. I hear he's got to be rejected and he's going to be killed, and I am out. And that's exactly what happens. In fact, the next verse says that Peter rebuked Jesus. Can you imagine? Peter rebuked the one who picked out the color of his eyes, how many hairs were on his head. But here's the thing that I want you to notice here. Peter, his narrative, the story that he's trying to catch Jesus up in, is not an evil story. Peter is craving justice and freedom. Those are not wrong things to want. They're not sinful. They're not bad. The only thing wrong is that Peter is trying to make Jesus a part of his story rather than being caught up in Jesus' story. I want you to think about that as you hear how harshly Jesus deals with Peter here. This is verse 33. But when Jesus turned and looked at his disciples, he rebuked Peter. "Get behind me, Satan. You do not have in mind the concerns of God, but merely human concerns." In other words, what Jesus is saying is, you are trying to make me a part of your story rather than being caught up in my story. And to Jesus, that made Peter the enemy. And what I'm going to suggest to you today is that when you and I attempt to make God a part of our story rather than being caught up in God's story, to God, that makes us the enemy. And this is scary because some of us verbally proclaim that we are faithful followers of Jesus. But if you look at the stories we are caught up in, we are actually enemies of Jesus. And if that's you today, if you feel convicted by that, I give you permission to zone out for however long the rest of this sermon is. Maybe just pause this video. I want you to go pray about that. Maybe think through, what do I need to change so that I am caught up in God's story rather than trying to make God a part of my story? You know, it actually makes me think of the verse in Matthew 7 on the Sermon on the Mount, verses 21 through 23. One of the scariest verses in my opinion, but I think that this is part of what Jesus meant when he says this. "Not everyone who says to me, 'Lord, Lord,' will enter the kingdom of heaven, but only the one who does the will of my Father who is in heaven. Many will say to me on that day, 'Lord, Lord, did we not prophesy in your name, and in your name drive out demons, and in your name perform many miracles?' Then I will tell them plainly, 'I never knew you. Away from me, you evildoers.'" God is not interested in being a part of your story. He's interested in catching you up in his story. But here's the other piece of this. Some of us have claimed to be faithful followers of Jesus, and we have yet to experience the beauty, meaning, and impact that we can experience by being caught up in God's story. One illustration and then I'll be done. Back when I lived in Edmond, I had a really good friend named Phil. Still a really good friend. But one day, Phil was having a really bad day. He had just had a long day. It was emotionally exhausting. He was physically exhausted. And after work, he came home and all Phil wanted to do was relax, play piano, watch TV, play with his dogs. So he gets home, he's ready to collapse, and his wife tells him, "Hey, your dogs, they're out of dog food, so you're going to have to go get some for them at the grocery store. And while you're at it, could you get these groceries for me?" Well, this made Phil pretty angry because all he wanted to do was go home and relax. But he knew what the right answer was, so Phil said yes. So frustrated as he was, Phil goes to the grocery store, He gets everything, comes back home, unloads it, and is about to sit down when his wife says, "Where's the dog food?" And Phil looks at her and says, "I forgot it." So at this point, Phil is furious, very angry, very upset. All he wants to do is be at home. But he gets back in his car. He's so angry. At this point, he's gripping the steering wheel. He goes back into the grocery store, gets a bag of dog food, is lugging it out to the car, gets out to the car, opens the car door, throws the dog food in as hard as he can out of anger, and as he does, the bag catches on the door, rips the bag open, and the food goes all over the parking lot. Well, I don't know if you've ever seen somebody who gets so angry that they just totally shut down and is like dead face. Well, this is what happens to Phil at this point. He just dead face, goes back into the grocery store, for the third time, gets another thing of dog food, comes out to the car, carefully places it in the back, and he is so ready to go home. He starts driving home, gripping the steering wheel, angry still. And while he's at a stoplight, he looks over and he sees a man there who's walking. Now, all Phil wanted to do was go home. But Phil is somebody who is caught up in God's story. And he knows what God has called him to do. So Phil rolled down his window, even though he didn't want to. And he asked this man, "Hey, do you need a ride?" Kind of hoping he would say no. But the guy says, "Yeah." So he gets into Phil's car, tells Phil his name is Suri. And Phil begins to take Suri back to Suri's apartment where he was walking from work. And as he's driving Suri tells Phil that the reason he's walking is because since he moved to America, he made one friend at work. And this friend had offered to give him rides. And so for the last few months, this friend had been giving Suri a ride. But more than that, this guy had started having a Bible study with Suri. And they'd been studying for months and months and months. But the week prior, this man died suddenly of a heart attack, totally unexpected. And Suri was left out in the cold. He didn't have any way to contact the family. He didn't know any other Christians. He didn't have any other contacts. He was from India. And so he had just been walking to and from work and just felt really, really lonely. Well, Phil sits in the parking lot of Suri's apartment complex with him. And he talks to him a little bit more, and Suri tells him that he had gotten to the point in studying scripture with his friend that passed away, that he was ready to get baptized. But now he didn't know what to do. So Phil says to Suri, "Look, I don't know you, but I do know Jesus. And if you're up for it, I'd be happy to baptize you today." And Suri said he would love that. So at this point, I come into the story, very minor role. Phil calls me up to the church to talk to Suri with him as he gets some of the baptistry things ready. And so I go up to the church and I talk with Suri, and Suri tells me how growing up in India, he had become disenfranchised with religion, and how studying scripture with this friend had meant so much to him, that he had fallen in love with the Jesus of Scripture. And I have never seen somebody so passionate about Jesus as this man. And so Phil gets everything ready finally, and he brings Suri back and he baptizes Suri. And then he gets Suri set up with rides from the church and Christian connections. Because Phil was caught up in God's story, he was able to make a huge impact in the life of Suri. And I'm here to tell you today that being caught up in God's story rather than making him a part of yours means having the most beautiful, meaningful, and impactful story that you could possibly have. God is not interested in being a part of your story. God is interested in catching you up in His story. And I would invite you to accept that invitation.